Welcome to Somebody Asked Me with Janice Case, the podcast where we take questions I've been asked in the past from so many different roles, along with questions you'll ask and we'll ask together to, learn. Along the way, we'll build our capacity to become a community of problem solvers. I'm your host, Janice Case. Let's get to it, shall we? All right, welcome everybody to episode 18 of Somebody Asked Me with Janice Case. So if you have been listening in, hopefully you've listened to episode 17. And if you have not, of course I'm going to encourage you to go back. We're going to encourage you, Melissa and I. But we're going to encourage you to go back to episode 17 because at the end of that we kind of set the stage for this episode. But before we get into it, I'm joined today by several folks. I'm going to start with, of course, Melissa. How are you, Melissa?
I'm well. How are you?
I'm good. So we've had kind of a couple of weeks off because we're honoring our commitment to each other, right? At the beginning of this, we said, look, this is going to come in waves. It's going to come in stages. We can't predict what this is going to look like. So when we've got it to share, we're going to share it. When we don't, we're going to hold back. So we're ready now to kick off the conversation, moving forward with our conversation around this idea of systemic racism by looking at one system of in our country here, and that is the system of education. Before we do that, though, I think when we chatted last time, Melissa, we agreed that there's some things we have to put on the table right up front. First and foremost, we're not going to tackle the system of education in its entirety today, right? Like we're gonna bite off a piece of it, right?
A nibble, even.
Yeah, exactly. Like a nibble, right? Bite is probably too big of a word, exactly. And we want to be really transparent, consistently as we've been, about the fact that this is a beginning. We're not going to fix it, like I said. We are going to offer some entry points. Our goal with every episode is going to be that at some point in it, and if not in it, then at the end, we're going to talk about actions you might take. If you're an educator, a student, a parent, a family member, a community member of an organization or what have you, right? What are some things you can be thinking about to help begin to dismantle institutionalized racism in our systems of education across the country? Today's episode is going to be general. We'll talk about that here in just a moment. And we're going to keep the conversations kind of general all along because there are going to be differences, right, based on the district you're in, the state you're in, the school you're in, etc. There's going to be a lot of variety based on the contextual makeup of where you are as a listener. So we're going to try to keep the conversation general enough that that it applies, right, if you will. If you hear us get into some specifics, we'll always just be cautious about reminding you that, we're coming from particular places in the country, if you will. And then I also want to offer our reminder to the group about semantics, right? That we've talked in earlier episodes that, we're being really careful about how we use words like minority and majority, or African American, or Black, or person of color, or Latinx, or so many others. So we're going to model being vulnerable and say, look, if we use an expression that doesn't sit well with you, feel free to reach out to us, right, and let us know. But know that it's not without being thoughtful on our end about understanding that there are all kinds of words that represent us in all kinds of different ways. Anything to add to that piece, Melissa?
No, I think the only thing, I say no and then start talking, but I think the thing that we wanted to point out as well is that sometimes, as much as we, as careful as we're going to be, generalizations are going to occur. So when you hear Black people, when you hear white people, when you hear, Latinx, we're speaking of the group in general.
Yes. We
are fully aware that not every single person in that particular group is going to fit into every single detail that we speak about. But we are speaking generally, and we're speaking about the most common issue that affects, that particular group. So that was the only other thing.
See, I'm glad you said no, but, because that was an important piece, so I'm glad about that. All right, so let's get into it. Why education and why first? Again, you're going to recall from episode 17 that we wrapped up that episode talking about the role of education in this country, and specifically we staged education as the critical system in this country because education drives both our individual and our collective economic futures. So institutionalized racism, then, unchecked in our systems of education, has resulted in part in a wealth gap that's getting bigger and bigger by the day in this country. We have to ensure, of course, that every child meets high standards and is set up for success in their post-K-12 endeavors. the fact is that racism manifests itself across systems of education in this country in many forms. And because education touches all of us, that's why we're leaping there first. So I say racism manifests itself in a lot of ways. I'm going to give a couple of examples. Some examples of areas that racism manifests itself in systems of education are the climate and culture that are created at all levels, right? Classrooms, schools, districts, etc. The curriculum, what we actually teach our children. Systems of student behavior and discipline within systems of education, the governance and leadership, what are the actual policies and procedures that have been put into place that in and of themselves are racist in nature and oppress certain groups. And hiring is another one, right? Like, do our kids have people in their education experience that look like them? And there's so much research about that. So again, we're not going to dig into all of these at once, and we certainly we probably won't cover all of these, even in the scope of this podcast over several episodes. But today we're going to start the discussion around institutionalized racism in systems of education, at where we're kind of describing as the level 1 discussion, right? By what we mean, and what we mean by that is that it's introductory. We're going to be talking mostly at broad levels and hopefully bring some clarity to some common terms and ideas that people are hearing now that might help them kind of inform their own thinking. So with that in mind, Melissa, you have a lot of lenses that you bring to the table, right? You bring mom and professional, and you can identify any others. What are you hoping to learn from the conversation today?
Because I am a mother and I have a teenager in high school, I really am interested in hearing the perspective from people who are actually involved in education.
Yeah.
I've heard plenty of public stories and examples of racism. I've seen examples of racism with my own son. But to hear it from the lens of a professional educator, I'm really looking forward to that. I'm also really looking forward to hearing it from the perspective of a parent who had to take on education. Yeah. So those two perspectives are extremely powerful and educational. And for me, as I've expressed to you and our guests in our planning sessions, I may be a bit more quiet than normal this particular podcast because I truly am here from the perspective of our listeners, probably more so than in any other topic, because I don't know a lot about the way things work in education. I only have the perspective of a parent in that regard, so I will be learning today quite a bit.
Excellent. That's fair. I appreciate that, Melissa. And we've talked about how important that is because you are going to think of questions that I don't think of. So that's why I value so much our partnership with this work. So to have this conversation, Melissa and I are joined by a previous guest, Henri Williams, and a new guest, my friend and colleague, Kirk Dolson. Gentlemen, we appreciate you guys joining us. And we're going to start by having each of you introduce yourselves in this context, right? In other words, what is the lens, what is the contextual piece that you feel like you're going to bring to this conversation today? So Kirk, since you're the newbie, we're going to start with you.
Sure. So thank you so much, Janice, for asking me to join. And Melissa, thank you for also being a welcome partner in this work. So yeah, my name is Kirk Dolson. I am currently the principal of Parkview High School in Loudoun County, Virginia, which is a suburb of the metropolitan D.C. area. In some cases, Loudoun is referred to as the richest county in the nation. It's a very wealthy, lots of wineries and horse country out in this western part of Northern Virginia. But my school is very unique. I serve a school that is 70% Latino, Latina, or Latinx, whichever you prefer. And we have about 45% of our students that are English learners. I have 12% of my students that are also homeless. And those students are, that means that they are part of the McKinney-Vento program, which is a federal program that provides them resources. We're also the only Title I high school in Northern Virginia. And so I come at this from a very unique perspective. Those of you that might be listening to this, I am a white male. And I serve a predominantly brown school. And where I think, and just since we last met with the planning session, I've really been reckoning the idea of, we like to say in education, all kids matter. All kids can learn. All means all. And a lot of us say, well, if all truly means all, then we have to start to disrupt and dismantle. And being a former English teacher, I really started examining that word all and that collective pronoun of all versus every. And I really think that what we need to start saying is the word every, because every kid matters. And what we really need to start looking at in education is how are we ensuring that every kid, every white kid, every black kid, every brown kid, every child with a disability, every kid, every family feels included and welcome. And I think right now, unfortunately, in our system that we have built for people that look like me and my kids, our system does not include every family and every student. Because I can tell you that in some cases, my families don't feel welcome in my building, and that's my role in order to change that. Not every child in my building feels like they have a voice when they have an issue with how a teacher's graded them or how an assistant principal might have disciplined them. So I think really and truly that's what has come to my, like I said, reckoning, even just since we've met. I also think that the idea of the systemic oppression and the systems that have been built really to, in my opinion, support white supremacy, we have to eradicate them. We have to take away this idea of deficit theory, and we have to take this idea away from being okay with low expectation. And that comes from, Melissa, you as a parent, you should have high expectations of your education system. And because in essence, we are a customer service entity, and you are our customer, just like your son is our customer. And so we really need to start shifting the mindset of how we produce education in this, in my opinion, in this country, in order for it to be inclusive of every child and every student. So that's why I'm really excited. I think people have to recognize the white privilege that we come to this work with.
So I'm going to ask you, Kirk, if you don't mind.
Yes.
I'm going to ask you to hold on that for a second, because we're going to come to that. And so with you kind of bringing to the table in this conversation the lens of leader of a school like the one you described, right, which is probably a descriptor of many, if not the majority of schools in this country, right? That's going to be a significant lens. Now I want Henri to turn to you. Henri, of course, has joined us before with the parent role or the parent lens, and certainly that's a lens that you continue to have. But what is it that you're hoping to bring to the conversation today as well?
Oh, well, thank you. And just again, Henri Williams here. And I guess for this discussion, I am, even though I'm a public health professional, I'm going to look at this as through the lens of a parent. A parent who's put 4 daughters through the public health system, through the public school system, excuse me. And as you mentioned, and if anyone has had a chance to listen to the previous podcast, went through having to, let's say, fight, for lack of a better word, the systems to address things that were occurring with my daughter. So I hope to bring that perspective and that lens to the discussion, to include, a parent who also recognized the importance and the need of inclusion in the school system. If my goal was to have my daughters be successful and achieve their optimal potential. So I hope to bring all of that to this discussion. And something I heard this morning, and I shared this in something I sent to all of you, but I want to say this again here. The difference between a moment and a movement is sacrifice. Mm-hmm. And I really hope this isn't a moment, that, we're all kind of reacting to the events that are occurring, the social, the racial tensions, and that we really think of this as a movement that is going to require sacrifice. When I thought about our prep discussion, and some of the things we talked about in terms of how do we change the system, how do we make this different, how do we make it equitable. It's going to require sacrifice. It's going to require sacrifices that might mean, in certain ways, your professionalism. It may mean financial sacrifices. It may mean really needing to allocate funding in different ways. But I really hope that at the end of the day, as you said, this is a beginning. And I hope this is a beginning to a movement that truly is going to embrace the things that need to happen and the willingness of everyone to make the sacrifices that would be necessary to make that happen.
So thank you both for being here, of course, and being a part of the conversation and the learning today. And Henri, it's such a great launching point because when I read that note that you sent today, it correlated very well with a conversation I was having with my colleagues and my organization earlier today. And in part of that conversation, I said out loud that I was worried. And I wish I had your language in that moment and I didn't, but I said, I'm worried that we're already seeing the cycle continue. And by that, I mean, it's only been 3 months since George Floyd was murdered. And even though we had this tremendous response globally, right? Globally, I can sit through an entire news cycle right now and not hear any conversation about race. 3 months later. Already, we're back at that point. Now, there's other things going on, don't get me wrong, and there's other things that are different from moments in the past. But your language, the difference between a moment and a movement is sacrifice, I think is so important right now. And I want us to keep it at the forefront as we have our conversation today because Henri is getting to a really real point, which is going to be that to dismantle systemic education, or racism in education rather, there will have to be sacrifice in all the ways that he just described, right? So let's go ahead and use that as our launching point. And one of the major concepts that we want to drill into today is this idea of equitable access to education. Because in education, as educators, we hear that a lot. We know that. We live it, we breathe it, so to speak, depending on who we are. And I think we're going to hear it a lot more. I think that the parents in the audience, if their school systems and districts are going to start having conversations around race, they're going to hear it more. So what we want to do today is give our listeners a good sense of what we mean by that. What does it mean, this idea of equitable access to education, and why does it matter, right? So I want to get a little bit on that from you, Kirk, as a school leader, and then you, Henri, from a parent perspective. So what does it mean to you, and why does it matter? And then we'll take the conversation from there.
Sure. So I think equitable access to education to me means that you've got a lot of different things going on because you've got a lot of different kids that need different things. And that's what equitable really truly means. If you've seen the meme or the picture of, you got different kids maybe trying to watch a baseball game or watch a football game, and you've got the different heights. And so you give them different levels of a stool to stand on. And that's what equitable is. They're not all getting the same height stool because your shortest person still might not be able to see over the fence or over the wall or whatever you're trying to talk about. Or whatever is in the way. And so, in my school, it's always asking the question, how can we? And saying, well, we can't do it that way because that's not the way it's done for this class, or that's not the way it's done for this group of students. The question I always ask, my teachers, or in some cases my colleagues, is, well, how can I provide blank for this group of students? Or maybe it's just for one kid. I think it's thinking always outside of the box, and it's including multiple measures of impact. And I use that word impact to really drive home the idea that I can buy a really nice, expensive textbook series that looks great, right? But Melissa or Janice might look at it and go, this has nothing about that interests me. This has nothing, and so it's going to sit on Janice and Melissa's bookshelf for maybe in their locker and never get touched because it doesn't interest them. So there's multiple measures of impact, because in order for education really to be that movement, I think that Henri is really talking about what we need right now, it has to make an impact. And if you're not engaging, if you're not inviting people into the conversation about how we can make that impact equitable across all levels, whether it be kindergarten or whether it be, and I'll just say it, college, we're missing out a huge opportunity. And one thing that this pandemic has taught me is that we have to seize some of the opportunities. And those opportunities are not opportunity gaps in kids or families. They're opportunity gaps in the system that we have just not been able to provide. And it's things like making sure that we have equitable access to the technology, making sure we have equitable access to things like food and shelter and clothing. And so all of that is part, in my opinion, of what equitable access to education really entails. It's not just the idea of going to school, and sometimes it's how you're getting to school. Do we have equitable access to transportation? All of those types of things are so important, because that makes the whole, and again, I go back to that word impact, it makes the impact on what education can be as a system.
Well, and I'll flesh out a couple of those things that you said, Kirk, to further those examples of equitable access. Equitable access to technology, right, or to Wi-Fi right now, of course, is huge, right, with distance learning. And the way it could look different is my kids already have access to Wi-Fi because I can pay for Wi-Fi and it's in my home, so they have access. But if the kid next door doesn't, then the school district might be paying for theirs. That's equitable access, right? To your point, it's not equal. It's ensuring we both have the same access, but how we get it might have to look very different because of our unique circumstances, right? As one example.
Yep.
So, Henri, flesh that out a little bit for us, this idea of equitable access. When you think about it in terms of whether it's anything that Kirk shared, I know you have some of your own thoughts, and I'm also interested in hearing what does it look like when it's not there, right? What does it look like when there isn't equitable access?
Well, it's funny because listening to Kirk, I kind of concur with most of everything he's saying. One thing resonated with me, and the idea of equal isn't always equitable. And so for me, it's more about is the playing field level. And what I mean by level, meaning regardless of who I am or what my needs are, am I going to have the same opportunities and the access to optimize my opportunities in this system? And that's not about equal. That's about, is the playing field level? Is it equitable? Are things in place to truly accommodate me, my differences, who I am, what I bring to the system? And as I mentioned, that could, detail culturally, linguistically, my level of education. Am I coming into the system as a transfer from a different state, from a different country? And the other thing, when you talk about what doesn't it look like, and what it doesn't look like is then I am not engaged. I am not a participant. My kid also, and I hate to almost say this, but becomes a victim of the system. And I don't mean victim in terms that things are always going to be bad or negatively happen, more than I'm not engaged or involved at a level that I can impact or respond or intervene when it's necessary or when, it just makes sense.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I don't hate, I hate to just oversimplify this, but for me, it just simply means it's the playing field level.
Yeah.
Well, I also think what it also looks like, or it looks like when it's not occurring, Janice, it also looks like segregation. Mm-hmm. It looks like segregated classes. All of your AP and honors classes are white, or your academies, if you might have academies in your systems, or your IB programs, they all look like kids that look like me. And that is the other piece, I think, that what Henri was talking about, is that equitable access to just leveling the playing field. I think, the other piece that it looks like is it looks like a high dropout rate, because most of us that are in education, you know, 9th and 10th grade, a lot of people worry about dropout rate in 11th and 12th grade. Those kids know they're going to drop out in 9th grade, whether you want to admit it or not. And as a principal, that's something that we have to really look at very, very carefully, because how are we then giving those kids the message that A, you matter, and B, you can do anything in this school, or you can do anything in this school system, or you can do anything in this state to get you where you need to be. And if college is your goal, we're going to help you get there. If getting a job is your goal, we're going to help you get there. If going into the military is your, so all of those access points that are so important, and again, I'm speaking from the high school perspective, but that are so important for those young children to hear about. But a lot of them, I will say, some of them enter into our public school system knowing they don't have the same opportunities that people that look like me do, and that's part of the systems that we have to start to disrupt and dismantle.
Yeah, agreed. Melissa, go ahead.
I'm very much a realist, and so I think the question that comes to mind for me is, how realistic is it that we will be able to, and I know it's not going to happen overnight, I'm not being, facetious or anything, but how realistic is it that we will be able to provide every student, and I love that Kirk uses the word every, because I think it's powerful, and it really draws to your attention what it is we're aiming for. But how realistic is it? And if it is realistic, what's the work that's going to be required to ensure that every student receives equitable access?
It's a great question. I think it's having the mindset and having that dedication. For me, it's hiring practices, right? It's making sure that I surround myself with people that don't necessarily think like me in the case of education sense. I mean, maybe have more of a creative way of approaching content, but they all have the same mindset of me about equity, and they are in this for the right reason. And when I say in this, I mean in the equity work, but also in the teaching and learning work. And it's one of those trite things that we all say as educators, being a lifelong learner. But I pride myself, and it's actually I don't know if any of you have seen Paul Gorski's 20 critical things that I will do to make myself a more equitable educator. And number 6 is me, because it says, I will never stop being a student. And I think that what we have to do as educators is we have to look at education through the lens of empathy, because what that does is it starts to then, in my opinion, it starts to display some of the cracks in the system. And to answer your question, Melissa, what we need to do is give kids the power, empower them with the tools to be able to, and go up to a teacher and say, that's unfair. You can't say that about me, or you can't say that about those people. That needs to start in kindergarten or in preschool, because that's how we empower kids to really change the system that's really meant for them. But I also know that that's a really intimidating thing to do, because I have a 14-year-old downstairs, and he would never do that. He would never challenge that authority. So my wonder to your question is, how do we as parents then empower our kids to really challenge that authority when they know that it's unjust what the teacher is saying or what the principal is saying? How do we empower them to make that change and make that shift, to start helping to disrupt and dismantle?
Yeah.
So what I'm hearing then is that it's a group effort. It's not just, I think a lot of people sit back and think, well, if we want the educational system to be equitable, then the schools have to do something. But it's the parents have to do something, the kids have to do something, the schools have to do something, the system has to do something. So I really wanted to just kind of grab that nugget and put that out there a little bit louder for the listeners, that there's something, as Henri said, there's some sacrifice we all need to make, or some steps we all need to take to make sure that we at least start down the road of getting this to become a reality.
Well, how about we start with the idea that the system, for lack of a better word, is broken.
Yeah.
And I mean, because if we don't at least start there, then you don't entertain the idea of, well, maybe there's change or something needs to be fixed. And we have to look at the systems. I could be wrong, and maybe you, Janice, and you, Kirk, could speak more to this, but I would challenge to say, have we changed much in how we deliver education, the pedagogy of education in maybe the last 100 years? Maybe I'm exaggerating. And if we just think about that and who we are now educating, the social changes in our societies, social, economic, and all of that. The system needs to change. The old system, it's like trying to fit new into the old, and it's just not working. And I just keep coming back to the system needs to change. You talked about teachers and administration. I'm in New York, and I think one of the things that you said at the beginning of this, some of this is really going to be different state to state, and I do recognize that. And, in preparing for this, I thought about, my own daughters and their education and, teachers and administration and what made a difference. And in the last podcast, we talked about an experience we had in the middle school. And I thought about that and I said, given her entire education, from start to finish in the public system, what was different about that? Well, it so happened when she went to public school, the principal was Black. And there was an administration that was the administration was truly diverse. When she went to high school, the principal was Black. The assistant, and when I think about that, not that everything's perfect, not that there aren't going to be problems, but there is at least a different level of understanding and a different level of response, when we were in those two, let's say, schools, than we were in a school where we didn't have that kind of administration. So, again, when you talk about how we're going to get to equitable education, how are we going to do this, I think we need to at least begin with the acknowledgement that what we're doing currently isn't working as effectively as we would like. And we may need to think about the systems in which we have that have been supporting it.
So, Henri, I'm going to build on that a little bit and say, it's the difference between reform and redesign. Right? So for decades, we've been talking about and doing school reform in this country because we've known for decades that the model that we introduced 100 years ago that essentially was designed to educate the masses to about an 8th grade literacy level, and by the masses, I mean white people, right? That it's not working for a majority of kids in our systems now across the country, right? Depending on where you are. And so we've been reforming and reforming and reforming when at the end of the day, what we now understand is, well, unfortunately, there's not a collective broad understanding, but what a lot of the research as we study high performing systems around the world shows us is that it is about the design of our systems. Right? And so we've been talking about equity, just like we've been talking about school reform in this country, for decades, right? For as long as I've been in education, we've been talking about equity. This is not new. We've done the trainings. We've set up the task force. We have the committees. We do the cultural competencies. We do all the things. But what we're not doing, what we don't do, in my opinion, two key things, right? And then I'll turn it back over to you all to either respond to those or bring up something different. Two key things that we're not doing is beginning the work by fleshing out our individual and collective biases and beliefs, right? If we don't at least flesh out the individual biases, and that then, of course, amount to our collective biases, and then from there build a set of beliefs, a collective set of beliefs, right? We can't get to equity. Put aside the obstacles from a financial perspective and all the sacrifices that you mentioned, Henri. We can't even begin to go there until we've done that. And then the second piece of that then, and kind of bred from it, is this idea of building equitable practices into every facet of the system, right? The equity trainings that make us feel good is great and it serves a purpose. But actually analyzing the context of the system, right? Take a particular school district, for example, and really fleshing out the policies, the procedures, the structures, the practices, etc., that actually essentially ensure that one group achieves at higher levels than another. That's design, right? That's system redesign. And so engaging in that becomes the next, in my opinion, critical step in this country, right? We have to individually, flesh out those pieces of biases and beliefs, and then from that we have to begin to think in terms of what the system design has to look, how it has to look different to ensure that there's equitable access, like we're talking about.
Yeah, I would echo. I'm sorry.
No, and I'll just quickly say this. You make me think. A friend of mine reminds me that all politics is local, and so when I say that, I think about the school board and school board participation, and going to the meetings and being vocal and speaking. And yes, and go ahead, Kirk.
And where they're elected, by the way, knowing who the heck they are and how they might influence the system of that district, right? Go ahead, Kirk, sorry.
Well, but I think to your point, Janice, one of the things that we also have to, and you kind of touched on this a little bit, and I jumped ahead early about just recognizing what white privilege really is, and to recognize that, our education system was built for white men. I mean, historically, it was built for white men. It's not built for white women. It was built for white men. And so when we think about all of the work that has been done, back to Henri's question about has it changed in 100 years, I don't know if it's changed in 200 years, because we're still basically in the same agrarian calendar. We all start school in September and we end in June. I mean, for the most part, obviously, different areas some areas have year-round school. But my point in saying that is, it's pretty much the same system. You go to school at 8 and you end at 3, or you end at 4. It is not, and that's what's so interesting about this time that we're in right now, is that system has been really blown up. And I think Janice has also touched on this a couple of times, which is if we don't take this opportunity and learn from it before we go back to face-to-face education, and I'm looking at Melissa, and I am hoping and praying that for your sake and your son's sake, it will change. And people's eyes have been forced wide open, because we can't go back to the way we were, because we're going to keep getting what we've always gotten, which is not good. It's high dropout rates. It's low engagement in classes. We've got kids that are fearful of going into honors classes and AP classes or the college track. And that, and what's really scary is the cycle just keeps repeating itself. And so I go back to that word impact. How can we impact enough voice? And Melissa, your point was really well appreciated by me, because it isn't just educators like myself or educators like Janice or parents like you and Henri. It really truly is. It's kids. It's the politicians that are willing to speak up and speak out. And we talked about this back in our planning meeting about, not calling people out about racial issues, but calling people into the conversation and being open and honest and speaking your truth. Because your truth, Melissa, as a mom is very different than my truth as a principal. But if we can have a conversation together about your son's education, and we both agree that's important, then we're going to come to some sense of consensus. We may not always agree, but we can at least come to a consensus that what's important is your son feeling valued and feeling as though he's being challenged and feeling as though he's engaged in his educational work. And that again goes back, we've got to then provide equitable access to all of those things for all of those parents and all of those kids.
Something you're saying makes me think about, going back to what it doesn't look like. And I said, you're not participating. And, something just resonated with me. And, more so at the high school level. Because at the high school level, you're making, as a student, a lot of decisions. You're deciding about classes in some cases. At least I know in New York that's the case. You're deciding about your curriculum. You're deciding about college at some point. And I don't know about you, but I'll speak for my 4 daughters. They weren't sophisticated enough at that point to truly navigate those kind of decisions and questions that they're posed with. Just think about a non-engaged parent who's not participating in the system and the decisions that your children are needing to make in that system and equitable education. And I put that also in the context of there are also going to be problems. And, I think about my second daughter, and, when she was hitting that wall of, you may not graduate, and what would have happened had I not been a participating parent coming into the school, engaging with the school, trying to work out what was truly happening versus she was on her own. So when you talk about equitable education, how do we ensure the participation, the continued participation of the parents throughout the process in terms of helping their children navigate and maneuver through the system?
So I'm going to share a little tidbit that both Melissa and Henri know, but most of the listeners probably don't know, is that Janice was my boss because I was an assistant principal under her as a principal of a high school. And one of the things that she taught me, and she did this as a middle school principal as well, is that, Henri, your point about the communication and the connection between parent and school, I would say probably, and this is going to maybe conservative, but I bet 80% of the times that parents hear from the schools, it's about a negative interaction between a teacher and a student.
Yes.
And that is something that, and again, I'm not trying to toot Janice's horn, but she really opened my eyes as as an administrator. And it was done as teachers too. We were taught, that you try to make a positive phone call. But as an assistant principal, most of the time you're the one that's calling because Henri got in trouble or Melissa was running in the hallway, and so that connection, Henri, your point is so valid and so important, is that most of our parents that they don't feel like their voice is important because all they feel like they're coming to the school is to be berated and being told that they're not basically being a good parent, which is so opposite of what we're trying to do, right? We're trying to bring them in and say, help me help you, but help me make your kid feel more connected or feel more valued or feel. And so, I speak very little Spanish, but like I said at the very beginning of this, I have a predominantly Hispanic community that I serve, and I make it with my broken Spanish that I, try very hard. But what that sends to my community is that I care and I value their culture. I value who they are as a community, and I try to I can get a parent from the main office to the counseling office, and I can do it all in Spanish. And I can say to them in Spanish, when your son is in my school, he is my son. And that makes the moms that we all know in Latin culture, they're very powerful, and it makes them feel like, okay, now I know. And what that also does is that when I have to make that phone call, those parents know that I'm calling not to berate them, not to chastise them, not to bother them, but it's something important that's happening in my son or my daughter's life. And so I think you're like, Henri, what you said, it's so important because if I'm going to ask you to help me make the school better, I've got to have a better connection than just calling you the first time and saying, hey, by the way, Janice, mouthed off to a teacher. I've got to have a rapport with you. And then we can have that conversation about your daughter or your son or whatever. But so many times we don't take the time to make that positive connection. And so at the onset of that negative phone call, and again, when you can talk about how those phone calls, how they look and how they play out because of the equitable approaches that a school takes in making sure that, the positive phone calls are also occurring. So it's actually it's a really twisted system, and going back to some of the comments that were being made, it's a crack in the system.
I think that you make a very valid point, Kirk, because I can say that in my son's education, he's going into his sophomore year of high school. I don't think beyond elementary school that I've ever gotten a positive phone call. Not that I get a lot of negative ones, but I don't get just he did really well on this, or he stood out at that. Now, in elementary school, that was a common thing. Because they had little, awards programs, or they had the little tickets they gave out for good behavior. So he'd come home with the hootie hoo, and I could, reward him. But middle school and high school, those types of things are no longer happening. And I only hear from teachers if there's a problem, whether it's a grade or behavioral or whatever the case may be. So I think that's a very valid point. And I think it also brings up another topic, which is the accessibility for parents. Their ability to be able to contact the school or to be able to reach out to students. Like, parents need that equitable access as well, because if I work, which I do, from 8 to 5 every day, it's not easy for me to get off and go visit a school or make a phone call to a teacher or follow up with anything until after the school hours. And so then I am relying on my son's recollection, relying on my son's truthfulness, relying on, the word of a teenage boy.
Listeners, she just rolled her eyes.
To assist him. So I think that that's another leg of the conversation, which is that I love the fact that we have to be active and we have to participate, but then we have to set up an atmosphere that makes that possible for every family, and not just the majority. Very true.
I talk about, we all, most of us, love to eat, right? And so it's one of those questions, and I pose this to a lot of my teachers. I'm like, so we want to make it such that we are inviting our parents and our kids to our dinner table. And we're making their favorite food every day, whether that be, something that we're ordering out, or whether it be something that we have cooked with our own hands. But we want them to feel like they are invited not only into our school, not only into our classroom, which I call the home, but we're inviting them to the table. And at that table, they're going to have a voice. And that your point, Melissa, is so, it pulls at my heartstrings, because so many parents don't feel like they have a voice. And that goes back to Henri's question about the idea that you're so right, Henri. We have so many kids that are picking classes, not because they're picking classes because their counselor's telling them to take the classes. And they're not picking classes they're interested in, because unfortunately, going back to the crack in the system, most kids think they have to take all of the classes to get the advanced studies diploma or the high school diploma. Well, you know what? They don't. They can get a certification and make really, really good money, going back to Janice's point about, some of the economy with all this. But we have so many kids that drop out because they feel like they can't attain the same agenda that their friends have, or that their older brother or sister did, or that and so I go back to that system. We keep cranking out what we've always gotten, and so we have to just kind of stop. And like I go back to, I'm trying to always look for the positive and everything. I'm an optimist. Janice knows that about me. This pandemic, this pause that we've all been forced to take, we have to seize it, and we have to do something with it. And I pray that our leaders, and God knows we need a better leader than we have right now, but our leaders that have the power to change the system will do that, and will take this pause and will make it better, because that's what we have to do.
So when you talk about, as a parent, and equitable access, that just resonates with me. And because that's where we have the intersect of the system. I felt very lucky, and not only was I a parent, I was a professional. The mechanisms by which you interact with the school are not set up for every parent. I was on the citywide school and safety committee. That occurs in the middle of the week at 2, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. PTA meetings, are arbitrarily in the middle of the week and some evening appointment. When we were talking earlier and you talked about complementary things, the thing that resonated with me were the old standard parent-teacher conferences, where you came in and you met with the teacher and, of course it'd be Johnny has his problem, but, he does great or she does wonderful or she gets along. And one of the things that was interesting, my daughter's a teacher in New York City. And she was telling me about her upcoming parent conference thing, and she didn't sound excited about it. And I said, well, why is that? And she said, look, I spend all these hours after school in the classroom and no one shows up. And it goes back to what you're saying. Is the system truly set up to enable these things? I think what you said, Kirk, this pandemic is a wonderful opportunity. Phelan has told me she has had more interactions with parents because of the opportunity of online meetings and the opportunity of scheduling those meetings at a time when people are available. So I quickly leaped to, why can't we start thinking about parent-teacher meetings? They don't always have to be face-to-face. Why can't we use the opportunity now of Zoom or WebEx or some other online opportunity that could, affect your schedule? Or as a single parent, I don't necessarily have to worry about dealing with the kids and homework and after school, after work things, and then getting to the school on top of that versus I can go on my computer and interact with the teacher. So, when I think about these things, it's about, are we willing to make changes and take advantage of the technology that will really afford more access and opportunities for, as you're saying, to really be engaged and be a part of what's going on?
Yeah, Janice and I have often spoken about how this pandemic has forced us to rethink the workplace. My job in particular was adamant prior to this that we could not work from home. It wasn't possible. It would be too difficult. It wouldn't work. And in turn, we've actually found out that it works better. I'm a salesperson. We're clocking numbers like never before. People are interacting with one another to get assistance when needed. So I'm hoping that other institutions, education especially, will take note of that. Like, not just because of COVID-19 and we're afraid to put children in classrooms, but because this might just be the best way for a child to learn, is through virtual learning or outside hours. Some kids are not morning people. I don't fully wake up till about 11, to be honest with you. So if a child could go to school different hours for hours where they're more productive, those kinds of changes are things we should truly be looking at. And I'm with you, Kirk, when I say that I hope that our leaders, whether at the national level or they're in different districts or right in individual schools, will be given that leeway to do what is best for their students. I really hope so.
It goes to, and this is a philosophical question, and we talked about it in the context of education, but, Melissa and maybe even Janice and Henri, I don't know about what your workplaces were prior to this, but your point, Melissa, about, not being able to work from home. So the question then becomes, what was the sacrifice? What was the, or were the systems that you worked within forced into figuring out, right? And figuring out,
and then finding that it worked. I don't think they ever checked to see if it would really work. And now they were forced to, and found that not only does it work, but it works better. Right. It saves them money. And, there's all these benefits that come from it. And I'm hoping that virtual learning will prove to be, be much of the same.
Well, and here's another secret about Janice, is that she taught me to not necessarily always ask forgiveness or ask permission, but ask forgiveness. So what you just said works for kids too, because we, as an assistant principal under her and now as principal of my own school, flexible scheduling is the key to some kids' success. Mm-hmm. It's the difference between them staying in school and dropping out. We ran a 4 to 6 program at Seminole Falls, and I modeled that, and it was for not just the kids that got in trouble, but I will say it was a way for us to say, you know what, Kirk, you can't be in school today, but you know what, your education matters, so we want you to come back from 4 to 6 when your friends aren't around, and you're going to sit in this room and you're going to do the work that you missed, but you're not going to be able to be in school, because we were not about, and we are not about, creating that school to prison pipeline. When my kids are not in my building, I know they're not getting the attention they need, but they may not be getting the food they need either. So we create systems in our school to make it such that kids still have access to what they need. I think that's the other part. Is that a sacrifice? It's a sacrifice, yes, but it's also what's right. And I think a lot of what we're talking about is we are being forced into seeing what's been so wrong in so many of the systems that we've all been asked to live within and live under. And now this pause has really caused us to look at things with an empathetic lens that has really revealed a lot that is wrong with the systems that we have in this world.
Well, and I'll reiterate something that you said, Kirk, this idea, and actually everybody has kind of said it or alluded to it, this idea that it's an opportunity, and the idea that the pandemic's an opportunity isn't new, but I think we have to say it a lot in a lot of places, because again, if you were somebody who was not connected to education as a parent, or you were even an educator who was just kind of checking a box, so to speak, every single day, what this has done is allowed us to see in part what works and what doesn't work, and in part because we were forced into a whole new structure. But early on, I felt like we had so many people saying, I can't wait to get back to. And I was the voice going, I hear you, and don't get me wrong, I know kids want to get back, I know teachers want to get back, I know, but remember, let's remind ourselves that the structures we had before weren't working for half the kids. So not every kid is sitting at home going, I can't wait to get back to school as it was before, right? Some of them are really, they want to get back to school and they want to get back to their friends, but that doesn't mean that it was working. And so what we have to do, and quite frankly, it's our moral obligation to do, is recognize what wasn't. Now that we're creating systems to do it differently, assess whether these new things do work, and then keep what does and abandon what didn't, right? And the great thing is we have an excuse right now. Before, there are so many barriers, so many obstacles. There are still lots of barriers and obstacles, but a lot of them, and Melissa, you identified this with your workplace, and it's certainly true in education. A lot of them were barriers based on assumptions. So Go ahead, Melissa.
Well, I just kind of remembering that we said that this was a level 1 kind of conversation. I was hoping that maybe we could get those of you who are educators that could tell us or kind of give our listeners a very brief idea of how racism manifests in school, like what that looks like. Because I think a lot of people are still under this impression that if it's not very overt or in your face, that they don't recognize it for what it is. So because it's built in to a system that's been in place for hundreds and hundreds of years, I think it would be beneficial to just give some brief, examples or explanations of how racism shows up in education, even at the smallest level.
So I'm going to jump in first, Kirk, if you don't mind, only because I have something fresh on my mind, and it's at the classroom level. So, we started the episode by saying all the different areas in the system it can manifest: governance and hiring and discipline, etc. So through some research for the role that I have and some learning we're doing with my organization this week, I watched a piece that basically was designed to help us see how our biases against or about certain, whether it's a race, whether it's a child from a certain type of home, whatever it is, can translate to racist, what I will say is going to be a racist data point, right? And the example is this, right? Kids in a classroom with a teacher, and you have, a teacher trying to engage conversation, around the learning, and you have a child who, raises their hand and is going to engage, but, maybe they're like, playing with their hair, and they're like laughing, and they're kind of goofing off, and the teacher jumps on that as being disrespectful or being rude or being what have you. And the next thing you know, that kid has a disciplinary referral, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the piece of data we were looking at is that in this particular area of the country, that 50% of suspensions were at the elementary level were of black girls. And when they started to dig into that, what they began to understand was teachers who misunderstood the nurture culture that black girls, in this case, in this community, come from, right? And so translate versus a teacher who can look at all of that, and regardless of whether it was intended to be disrespectful or not, regardless, can kind of ignore it and continue the learning moving forward without having to make it a barrier to the child's learning. So at the classroom level, that's an example, right? That's an example of how it gets there. Kirk, what you got?
Well,
I don't think I
Henri,
ever
go
thought
ahead.
of that. That's a good one.
Yeah, Henri,
well,
go
you know, and Janice, you just to expand on that, let's just talk about discipline. And I think anybody who, you know, has watched the news, has seen stories of how Black and brown children are disciplined differently,
Yep.
to include, in some instances, actually assaulted by the school intervention workers
Yep.
at a percentage or a degree very different than the white students.
Exactly.
Or as you said, Janice, for things that you would not, let's say, call the interventionists for if you were a white student versus a brown or a black student. Another thing where it really resonates, and this one hit home for me, I think it was last year in the New York Times, they did an article. I don't know if you're familiar, Stuyvesant High School, Brooklyn Tech, and Bronx High School of Science are these specialized high schools in New York City. I went to Stuyvesant High School. It was a front page story of how you had to take a test to get into the school. And the percentage of entering students who are non-white was so low, it was literally shocking and became a front page story in the New York Times. Well, they dwelled into, well, how did this happen? And so when you talk about equity and opportunity, the way you get to Stuyvesant in these schools is in junior high school, you are prepped, you are told, you are actually prepared to take these tests. And what they found out is depending on what middle or junior high school you went to, you literally had little or no knowledge of that opportunity.
There you go.
Especially if you were a brown or black student. So when you talk about how does this manifest in schools, it manifests in terms of opportunities. It manifests in terms of where we may direct you in terms of education and continued education. It manifests you in terms of what schools we think you may want to go to or can go to. Yeah, those are the things I think about, discipline and opportunity.
Well, and the
I think
opportunity, and
that's
Kirk mentioned APIB classes, right? If you're in a system where you haven't actually put structures in place to ensure that any kid who wants to take an upper level class can, then usually that system is saying, okay, who do we recommend? And some educators will not recommend some kids because it might be too hard and they don't want them to be upset or stressed out, right? That whole notion of loving them to death. With low expectations, right? Kirk, I know you're going to add something.
Well, no, and I also think it manifests itself in your hiring practices as a school system and as a principal. I'm actually proud to say that we, as an administrative team at my high school, took this school year and it was this school year because I said, I want us to go out and seek for candidates that look like our students and so I was going through this as I was doing my welcome back letter to my staff yesterday, and I was counting, and we about 40% of the new staff that we hired is staff of color, and I'm so proud to be able to say that. Is it where it needs to be? No, because 70% of my students are students of color, but we are on the right track. You know, we are paying close attention to it. I think to the micro and macro aggressions, Melissa, that occur in this public school systems, it turns my stomach because coming from a school, and some people may be aware of this, but the first Friday of my second year as principal, a student was shot and murdered on the way to the bus stop. And my entire school was on lockdown for the entire day. It was all over the news. It was on CNN. I had, FBI, I had state police. And it was the toughest day of my life because for that moment, I knew that I was the parent and the husband, and for those people that were locked inside that building, I was the person that was calling all the shots. I forgot that I had my own 3 kids and I had a wife, and I had to have colleagues from another school call my wife and say, hey, we got an inside scoop, Kirk's okay. But, my son was in 9th grade and he was getting texts and tweets that your dad's dead. Because that's what happens when you're in a situation like that. You're so focused on the tragedy that's taking place, and you're the person that's calling all the shots. The reason I say that is because the outcry that came from the public's opinion and perception of kids at my school, because they are mainly Hispanic, and they made the assumption that they were all gang members. And some of them are associated. And I'm proud to say that, you know what, gang members need an education too. And I treat them all the same, just like all of the other students that walk in through the hallways of Parkview. But my point in saying it is that had not occurred. And so there was this utterance of, well, Parkview is the bad school or Parkview is the gang school. And so when that happened, I had to force the system to be okay with someone that looks like me going, yeah, we do have gang members at Parkview, and they're some of the nicest kids you would ever meet, and they're polite. And I actually invited one into my home because he needed a person that was he was thrown into foster care, and he asked me to be his representative. Because he said, you're the only person that I trust, and you're the only person that I feel like I can say what I really want to say, and I know that you will make sure that I'm okay. And after modeling that, and after modeling that, these kids, they're just kids. That's what they are. They're kids. Well, first they're humans, then they're kids. That is what is so important. And after modeling that, I am certainly, and I will look all of you in the face, and I will say this to all of the listeners out there, just because you teach at a predominantly, a school that serves a predominance of students of color does not mean you're not racist. That's a mistake. That is a misnomer. There are a lot of white educators that say, oh, well, I work at such and such school, so I'm not racist. False. It is not true. And, I hate to say that, but it is not true. And so those of the listeners that are out there that have those people that they're afraid to challenge, don't be afraid, because if you feel like it's racism, it probably is, and it needs to be disrupted and, in my opinion, dismantled. So I think, and it goes back to just the biases that we all make. Like Janice said, the kindergartners that are touching each other or whatever. Then you've got in my school, it's out front of our library, and it's where a lot of the African American boys hang out. And I see teachers, walk by, and they kind of go I go and I stand there and I hang out with them, because I'm like, you guys, you know what? You're gonna have to go to class in 30 seconds, and sometimes I have to walk them to class. And I always say, Miss Case, so-and-so was with me, so he's good. So we don't walk into a situation where, I have to explain to my teacher why I'm late. But it's those subtle things that can, make or break a situation. And unfortunately, I think the other piece of this is that a lot of times adults, they want to win when they are in a conflict with kids, and they don't, and I don't know why that is, but they don't ever want to sit there and say, you know what, you're right, I'm wrong. And I think that's the other part of this, that whether that is an ageism thing or whether it's a racism thing, I think it's probably both. But that bothers me more than anything, about the fact that we have a lot of adults that are in the education system that fear the 2 words, I'm sorry, to kids. And again, going back to whether that it's a racist thing that, a teacher needs to apologize for being racist, or whether it's a teacher needs to apologize for just being wrong, because a lot of times they are. And that's a wonder that I have.
Yeah. And that kind of gets us almost to power struggles. Henri, I think you were going to jump in.
Well, and again, I don't want to miss this point before we run out of time,
Yeah.
because you talk about equity and how do we affect that, and how do we ensure that. And I want to go back to, like you said, we're not going to change the whole system, but it comes back to local.
Yeah.
And on the local level, where we do have the power as the community, parents, is participation. We can participate. We can go to these meetings. We can go to the school boards. Crisis provides opportunity. This is an opportunity to rethink how those meetings are structured. As I mentioned, online. Different times are more accommodating. In our preparation, something we talked about, is the school welcoming. I mentioned something that I shared with you, something we did at the state, which is called walkthroughs.
Mm-hmm.
And, walkthroughs, was built off of the World Cafe concept, and you're familiar with that. And it was literally, just to cut to the chase, coming up with a very detailed structure of having a collective group of parents, and it was parents. Well, we're doing with providers. But what we wanted to do is ensure everyone involved in the walkthrough was a stakeholder. So in the school, your stakeholder would be teachers, administrators, parents, maybe community members. What the walkthrough would be is, does the school feel welcoming? And it would be from the time you walk in the front door to the front lobby, to the classroom, to the hallways. And what does welcoming look like? Depending on my community, does it reflect the cultural aspects of my community? Does it take into consideration that, the student body is of different races, different nationalities? Something else I was struck with when we talked about how do we empower parents? I remember as a parent, every year there's orientation. You come to the auditorium and they vomit information out at you. Excuse me for putting it that way. Why can't we think of that differently to include how we even structure that to enhance the participation of that? And so can orientation really be inclusive of ways to how do we empower and bring people into the process? How do we engage you more? Tell us what you need, and how we can better respond to your needs. Something I talked about is parent champions, who can work in conjunction with the school to help navigate and help some of the newer parents navigate through these systems. They talk about handbooks, our handbook's always useful. A good walkthrough is, let's walk through that handbook. Is that handbook really relevant in 2021 in terms of the population we're serving? Something that comes to mind is literacy. And I don't mean just literacy, do I read or write? There's health literacy, and in terms of the school system, I'm going to make up a word, educational literacy.
Yeah.
I bet you have talked to parents and their eyes are glassed over. And part of that is, are you speaking to them at a level that they can understand or really engage in that dialogue and discussion? So I guess, when I think about a walkthrough, it's about looking at all the systems that we have in place that are engaging our students, our parents, our community. Are they welcoming? Are they working? Where can we make some improvements?
So kind of going back to where we started, which is perfect because we are going to start to wrap up here. So I appreciate you giving us a lot of actions from the perspective of the parent side, but also of the school side, questions for the schools to think about. But kind of part of where we started this was the idea of analysis of the current structures of the system to see where they do foster, right, the welcoming, they do foster equitable access, and where they don't, and then how do we change where they don't. So Kirk, we only have a few minutes left, but I want you to give A couple of examples, we focused pretty much in this episode on this idea of equitable access to education. And certainly since George Floyd was murdered in March, we are on a trajectory, right, to be more deliberate in our systems of education, to really root out, as I said, right, what are the things that are contributing to or taking away from an equitable access to education in all the ways that we've described and so many more. Give us a couple of things that you're thinking about and or doing now with your team that maybe you weren't doing yet. I know you've been doing a lot of work. You're, and I think Henri will agree with this. Henri introduced me to the term white ally, right? And so with that in mind and knowing that that's absolutely what you are, what are some of the things that you all are doing now that you maybe couldn't have done 6 months ago because unfortunately there wasn't the urgency that there is now?
Right. So I think it's about making the connections to families that on such an intimate level that we would not have taken the time to do because when you've got a building of 1,500 to 2,000 kids, being able to reach one and taking the time sometimes is cumbersome. We do it, but we don't do it on the intimate level of doing it through a Google or a Zoom meeting, or maybe just even a phone call. So I think what I call our student success team, that is a group of educators that really does get together and they talk about individual kids. They talk about every kid, to go back to Melissa liking that word. We really talk about every kid in every situation, and then we're able to do some of those wraparound services. And I mean wraparound from the sense of what does the family need? What does the kid need? What do maybe the younger siblings or cousins or nieces and nephews need? But I think what we've been able to really do, Janice, is make it, and I'm just going to speak for my high school, Parkview, really be seen through the lens of parents as a service, not just a school, but a place where I can go get services. And in some cases, that's public services. That's getting help with immigration services. That's getting help with how do I get meals. That's we've delivered diapers to young moms, but also aunts and uncles. So I think that has given us an opportunity to emphasize the services that a school can provide beyond just curriculum, but really that connection piece. And it's given us an opportunity to amp those services up, bringing our United Mental Health team services together, and not just rely on the public service agencies that we tend to rely on, but really use the assets that I have in my staff and the talents that I have in my staff and really create some great systems of service that now people are going to be willing to reach out. And when we do open back up, I foresee us having a lot more parental interaction because they're going to come to us, not because their kid's in trouble or not because they have a question about the class their kid's taking, but hey, I need help. Can you give me, and that's that opportunity that I think we're going to seize and make that outreach a lot more manageable.
Appreciate
Community
that.
social capital.
There you go. Yep, I love that, Henri. I love that. So we've covered a lot, again, mostly under the umbrella of equitable access, and I appreciate that you both were able to, in these kind of final moments, give some concrete ways, right, that people can be thinking about this, again, regardless of the lens that the listener might have right now. Melissa, I'm going to put you on the spot and ask you to share with us kind of a couple of your big takeaways, since we're not going to do a typical follow-up, breakdown of this. A couple of your key takeaways. You said in the beginning you were going to be listening and learning, and you've done that, but also contributed so much. What are a couple of things that you feel like are really important to hone in on?
Let me say, you guys did not disappoint. I feel like I'm walking away with a clear vision of what I would like my son's educational experience to be, and realizing that may involve more participation from me as a parent, and me also taking on the responsibility of finding ways to ensure that he has equitable access. I think that oftentimes as parents, and I can honestly say that in my experience for certain, I kind of sit back sometimes and just, well, the schools, they don't offer that. But I've never asked the school if they would be willing to offer that. I've never gone to the school and said my son would be better this way. Or, are they like, one of the things that I learned was that he doesn't have to take every class that he's told to take. I never knew that. I'm under the assumption that these are the classes he's assigned because these are the classes he has to take. So the involvement piece, the participation piece was really big for me, but also just laying out how it manifests in the educational system and in the experiences, I think is something that all of the listeners will hopefully walk away with something to chew on and something to think about and something to challenge within their own homes, with their own children, and with their educational system. We tend to think sometimes that, if my kid's not being called an N-word in class, there's no racial problems in the school. And that's simply not the case. And we have to look a little deeper and dig a little deeper and, look at the accessibility of school materials like books and computers and classes and all of those things. So I think those were my big takeaways is the involvement, the participation, and then the fact that there are steps that an educator can take that I just may not be aware of.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I love so much about you, Melissa, and I love how you captured that, because when you started with the participation piece, I was a little bit worried about that being parent-centered versus system-centered as well. And then, of course, you came around with the system piece, right? Because in my mind, the participation piece has to go hand in hand with the system being designed to welcome you, right?
And I think that's what I walked away with, is that idea that it doesn't rest on one part's shoulders. Yeah. It's not just on the shoulders of the parents. It's not just on the shoulders of the teachers. It's not just on the shoulders of the school board. It's all of us. Yeah. We all have to take the steps. Some have bigger steps and bigger roles of responsibility, absolutely. But our goal, I would think our individual goals are finding out what our role is and making sure that we are taking those steps and doing those.
Yep, I love that. Henri?
So let me just jump in. When you're talking about participation and systems, that is really so important. Because I wish I could say all these wonderful students had engaged parents, but they don't.
They don't.
And so what's the safety net? And so when I think about this, we're talking to what you, me, or other parents can do. And unfortunately, you have that parent, that guardian who is invested. But if you don't, how do we affect the system to provide that safety net for those same needs, for those children to still achieve the same opportunities and success that we want? As we go back to what you said at the beginning, every kid.
And that's the partnership, right? So I'm gonna wrap us up, and I'm hoping that every single one of you on with me right now, Henri, Kirk, and Melissa, are in a moment where you're like, but I have 10 more things to say, because there's a lot more to say, and so hold on to it, because we're going to come back. And I hope the listeners are listening, going, but what about this, and what about that, and what about the other, because for the same reason. And I'm going to wrap us up, I think, this way. Henri started us again with that quote, the notion of the difference between a moment and a movement is sacrifice. And I had already planned on wrapping this conversation up with a reflection from John Lewis, because since our last episode, Melissa, we certainly lost an incredible asset to this country. And he said a couple of things that I think are going to be a really great way to wrap this. He says, first off, when I think about education systems and the conversations we've had, he says you have to tell the whole truth, the good and the bad, maybe some things that are uncomfortable for some people. Right? And part of what is going to be uncomfortable, to Henri's point, is that sacrifice piece. And then, of course, he also says there's nothing wrong with a little agitation for what's right or what's fair. And I'm going to argue that we're going to need a lot of agitation to dismantle institutionalized racism in systems of education in this country. But I also think that we have at a moment in time that both calls for it and frankly is going to get out of the way for it and let it happen. So thank you to each one of you for being a part of the conversation today. We are very much looking forward to continuing the conversation, and certainly hope you're going to join join us again. So right after we hang up, I want you to jot down, like, here are the things I know we need to talk about next, so that we can come back. But otherwise, on behalf of all of us, thanks so much, you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.